Welcome to the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865. This is Melinda Klein. The North and the South had long been on a collision course, ever since the framing of the Constitution had divided both regions. Although both the North and South prospered economically in the 1850s, both claimed to see weaknesses in each other. In the meantime, the election of 1860 loomed in the distance. With the new Republican Party having done so well in the 1856 election, and with factionalism among Democrats, voters opted for the more stable choice, Lincoln, from the Republican Party. Southern politicians saw the election of Lincoln as an act of war. On February 11, 1861, as he was on the train from Illinois to Washington, Lincoln organized his cabinet with war as imminent on his presidential agenda. South Carolina led the South in seceding first. The creation of an independent Confederate nation in defiance of the United States was the immediate cause of war. That is, secession itself triggered the war. The secession of 4 more states was, from the Southern viewpoint, a protest against Lincoln's call to invade the South. From the North's point of view, it was an attempt to defend the nation after it was attacked at Fort Sumter. Lincoln's war goals evolved and were separate from the causes of war. He did not emphasize national unity during the 1860 campaign, but brought it to the front in his March 1861 inaugural address. Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, was one of the 3 remaining Union-held forts in the Confederacy, and Lincoln was determined to hold it. Under orders from Confederate President Jefferson Davis, Confederates under Pierre Beauregard bombarded the fort with artillery on April 12th, forcing the fort's capitulation. Northerners reacted quickly to this attack on the flag and rallied behind Lincoln. Lincoln called for recruits, and within 90 days, he had over 74,000. For months before that, several Northern governors had discreetly readied themselves and their militias for war to begin. Jefferson Davis, the newly elected president of the Confederacy, believed that the states' rights theory protected the rights of the minority against a tyrannical majority of the Northerners. Overall, before Fort Sumter, 7 Gulf states seceded from the Union on February 9, 1861. They created their own constitution similar to the U.S. Constitution. One exception would be that it protected slavery. It also protected states' rights. Over the course of the war, between 618 and 633,000 soldiers would die between 1861 and 1865. There's 2 significant reasons for this huge loss of life. Number 1, military fighting styles did not keep up with the capacity of firearms to kill more effectively. And number 2, disease killed 2/3 of men in camps or injured during battle. In reading about the significant battles of the Civil War, I'd like you to keep in mind the 3 phases I've stated here: opening battles, the decisive year, and the last stage. From the beginning of the war, women sewed shirts, knitted socks, provided medical supplies, collected food. It's known that young Irish women participated in the war itself as cross-dressing as soldiers to get paid, sending money back to their families. It would be during this war that the American women found themselves a profession outside of teaching and midwifery, and this was nursing in hospital wards. This war was fought in the Chesapeake Bay Area, and in southern areas from the Mississippi River to Savannah, Georgia, the Carolinas, and also in the Atlantic Ocean. Each side had enormous costs to meet for soldiers' wages, food, uniforms, artillery, and more. There are 3 ways to raise money for a war. Number 1, print it. Number 2, tax for it. And number 3, borrow for it. Military developments during the American Civil War included rifled muskets, cartridge rounds, repeating rifles, Gatling guns, ironclad ships, air balloons, submarines, and more. Repeating rifles had been invented prior to the beginning of the war, but the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department dismissed the new inventions because it was thought that troops would waste ammunition. It would not be until late in 1863 that Federal soldiers received repeating rifles. The naval engagements of the American Civil War were different from previous wars. Although not invented as a result of the war, the use of ironclads, submarine warfare, and the introduction of newer and more powerful naval artillery ushered in a new era of war at sea. Nations such as France and England quickly realized with the introduction and success of ironclads that newly crafted frigates, small iron-hulled ships, were clearly inadequate with the low-lying American type of metal battleship. A soldier's life in the Civil War was difficult. War weapons were effective, fighting styles hadn't changed very much, camp life was full of disease, and medicine was just beginning to come to understand infection and wounds. Many men simply died of their infections. Doctors did not know much about bacteria and how it was spread when a wound is not properly sterilized. One of the extreme conditions of camp life would be that of Andersonville, Georgia. Over the course of the war, 41,000 Northern prisoners were encamped there. Close to 13,000 would die as a result of camp conditions, specifically dysentery. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought in and around the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was one of the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War. Between 46,000 and 51,000 Americans were casualties in the 3-day battle. That November, President Lincoln used the dedication ceremony for the Gettysburg National Cemetery to honor the Union dead and redefine the purpose of the war in his historic Gettysburg Address. The New York draft riots in New York City were violent protests against Abraham Lincoln's Enrollment Act of conscription, planned to draft men to fight in the ongoing American Civil War. Irish immigrants did not take this news well. Free blacks were not considered citizens and were excluded from the draft. And also, for $300, a large fee could be paid to be exempted, which was out of the reach of many poor and working-class Irish. By April of 1865, the war was at a close. By April 9th, the war was over. But on April 14th, just 5 days after Lee's surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, the president was assassinated at 56 years of age. These are the constitutional amendments that finally ended slavery, that redefined citizenship, and also gave voting rights, regardless of race, to American men. This war freed 4 million slaves from bondage. What followed was a period of reconstruction that would bring the nation back together and start the difficult road to recovery for Southerners, both black and white.